It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Plokhii to our class meeting today. And as you all know, Professor Plokhii teaches Ukrainian history at Harvard University, and he's also the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which publishes all of these fabulous books that make research on Ukraine possible. Professor Plokhii has written extensively, really extensively, produces a book before I can finish reading the previous one. And he's written on such topics as origins of Slavic nations, on the Cossack period in Ukraine, on the history of Russian nationalism, on the Cold War, and on numerous and varied topics of Ukrainian and Eastern European history, such as the Yalta Conference, Chornobyl, and figures such as Hrushevs'kyi and Stepan Bandera. Professor Plokhii has also won numerous awards and numerous well-deserved awards for his publications. And all of these publications, at least what is important about them for me personally, is that they position Ukraine in this broader cultural framework of European history. So Professor Plokhii, thank you for taking this hour to meet with us and for agreeing to answer some of our questions. So just so that you know who your audience is, you're meeting with two groups of Cambridge undergraduates. They're enrolled in two papers that are offered by the Slavonic section. The SL9 paper, which introduces students to the language, literature, and culture of Ukraine. And this paper is convened by Andriy Smitsnyuk, who you briefly saw at the start just a few seconds ago, and myself. And you're also meeting with students from the SL12 paper, which covers the history of Socialist Russia from 1917 until 1991. And that paper is convened by Daria Mattingly, who I think you know already. And collectively, our students have read three of your books: Gates to Europe, Tsars and Cossacks, and the Lost Kingdom. And in fact, students in the SL9 class have called your book or labeled your book the SL9 Course Bible, okay? We have many questions to pose to you in 15 minutes of the allotted time for this meeting. And I will begin by posing the first question, and then I'll open the floor to questions from students. And I would like to ask all of the students to keep your video on so that we can see you, but to turn your microphone off or turn it on only when asking a question. So please indicate that you would like to ask a question in the chat box or simply by waving and raising your hand. Okay, I think enough of me, so we're ready to begin. So my question to you, Professor Plokhii, is twofold. First, I would like to take you back in time and ask you to tell us what prompted you to study Ukrainian history. And secondly, I would like you to tell us why you decided to write the books Gates of Europe and Lost Kingdom. As a general introduction, I think that will work.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, you know, we had this wonderful plans that I would come to the Cambridge University. Unfortunately, because of coronavirus, it didn't happen. I'm not giving up completely on that idea or that hope, but thank God that we have Zoom and other possibilities to still stay in touch and communicate. So again, it's my pleasure to see you. Regarding my question, regarding the questions that Professor Pavli just asked, well, my road to the Ukrainian history was, I don't think it was complicated. I think it was natural in the sense that when it happened, I was a young man, and we are all looking out there and trying to find what interests us. And I was a child of the Cold War, and what interested me was international politics. And on the other hand, I also grew up in the city of Zaporizhia, where there was, even during Soviet times, a very particular cult of Zaporozhian Cossacks. So I was interested in that as well. And these two interests in the international history and history in Ukraine actually have been with me since very early on, since the very beginning. And I am, it's kind of a norm to do either one or another. And I'm still trying to find the effective way how to combine the two. And out of that come books with maybe sometimes more emphasis on the international history, sometimes more emphasis on Ukrainian history. And what I try to achieve is really to integrate the world history into Ukrainian one and vice versa. I'm not very original in doing that, in the sense that despite the fact that my path to that was my personal particular circumstances that came together to influence it. But there were other people, and are other people, who arrived to the same basic ideas through their own life experiences, stories, intellectual experiences as well. And the institute that I'm the director now was created by two really very, very interesting individuals. One was Professor Omelian Pritsak, whose field was really Turkic languages and cultures. And another was Igor Shevchenko, and I guess maybe you are familiar with those names and read some of their works. Igor Shevchenko was a renowned specialist on Byzantine history and culture. And these two people, one Turkologist, another expert in Byzantine history, came together to create Ukrainian studies at Harvard. So you can imagine that from the very beginning, it was a very international undertaking in its own right. So in a sense, my trajectory was almost, was unexpected on one way, but on the other way, quite natural in the sense of where I landed up. So that's a long answer to the first question. And the second one about the gates of Europe. Well, I didn't plan to write that book. I will be honest with you, it is based partially on my lectures. So I had an idea of publishing something based on my lectures, maybe at the time when I will be retiring. Why would I want to publish something and then would go back and write a new set of lectures, right? So that made sense under the circumstances. And then really the revolution of dignity happened, and the annexation of the Crimea and war in Donbass. And you open the news and you see that all the news, February 2014 or something like that, are on Ukraine, and you think, okay, are you looking at some Ukrainian news service or wire? No, you check it, it's Reuters, so it is BBC or something like that. And a lot of what was coming there was good reporting, but what was clearly not there was the context. And the people who were reporting on those events coming from the West were really coming with zero background, with zero understanding where these things are coming from. And that was the gap that was out there, and I decided to sacrifice whatever my plans and decide, okay, I'll do a new set of lectures on the basis. And I tried to use the ones that I had and turn it into a book, which turned out to be a very, very interesting experience in its own right, because I created something new, something that wasn't really there in the lectures. First of all, my lecture, the course that I'm teaching is Frontiers of Europe, History of Ukraine since 1500. So I had to go back into the times of Kievan Rus and Herodotus and so on and so forth, and it is extremely scary, right? My academic writings start really in the 16th century, so those were uncharted waters. And then you have also, if you write the history of a place and place as diverse as Ukraine, and you try to put it in one book, you want to figure out, okay, what is the overall argument is, right? You're writing your papers, and professors you're pushing. What is the argument? I'm trying to do that as well. And what is the storyline? What is there that links together the entire period from Herodotus to the war in Donbass? And I had before that two very successful attempts in two very successful attempts in here in the English-speaking world to write about history of Ukraine and produce surveys. One was Orest Subtelny, which is again quite simplistically called the history of Ukrainians. And then there was it's not the official title, but that's how the book is referred in the academic circles quite often. Then there was a book by Robert Magachi, which again, quite simplistically was called the history of the territory and history of minorities or something like that. And there was a debate and discussion going on maybe for 15 or 20 years, which approach is right. And I thought that at some point that debate stopped being productive. So the model that I used was, again, I was shamelessly borrowing from both approaches. But the overall framework is, of course, cultural history. And that's what I found, something that could actually connect all this period, all this era from Herodotus to the war in Donbass, from the Scythians to Kyborgs. And another thing that I brought into this survey was what we are familiar with as spatial turn. Again, we at Harvard has this wonderful resource which is called Mapa, Digital Atlas of Ukraine, where you could actually go and create and build your own maps, and it's a wonderful teaching resource, but also research resource. So I was interested in the maps. I was part in my thinking of that special turn. So that also is reflected in the book. And then just the final thing, okay, you want to be, sometimes you think that enough of euphemism, enough of other things. And I was probably the first to introduce in such way the Norman theory into the survey of Ukrainian history, something that was taboo for centuries and decades, by engaging in an act of sacrilege, I guess, calling Olha Helgi, and given Scandinavian names to the first princes. And I thought that I would be crucified, especially in Ukraine, when the book was translated, but somehow, I don't know, that they didn't create any reaction whatsoever, negative or positive. So it was just accepted at the face value. As this metaphor that I was struggling a lot, the gates of Europe, okay, there are gates of Europe in Portugal, whether it's fair to do that, and it looks like that metaphor is now accepted, but something that allegedly was there forever. Again, it's interesting to see what happens with your text. So again, sorry for being so long. We professors are programmed to have sentences at least 50 minutes long. That's how we are paid, basically. So, yes, so I'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I think the book was specifically written for the SL9 course. That you
Okay.
edition and wrote it for us. But I have now changed the screen, so I hope maybe if all of you can change the screen to a gallery view, and we can engage in a question and answer session. Would anyone like to be the first to raise their hand?
Okay. And you have a possibility of unmuting yourself, so it's not that Professor does that. Okay, good. Sure, yes.
Yeah, so I have a question specifically about annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass. Do we have now enough information to write the history of the war right now? And if yes, then who would you recommend personally me to read to understand it better from the historical point of view?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a big methodological question whether we have enough sources to write a history. And in the 19th century, the Mikhailo Dragomanov, the figure that you might be familiar with, was having this position, okay, we have first to go and publish sources, and then should be the narrative of Ukrainian history created. This is a good approach, and eventually that's what happened when Hrushevs'kyi wrote his history. But it's not an excuse not to have a narrative, not to have a history, because again, it's basically, this is history, it's the way how we make sense out of the past on the basis of the sources that we have right now. And in that sense, yes, it's perfectly okay and fine to write history of the annexation of the Crimea now, despite the fact that archives are not open, the sources are not there, but we need some understanding of what happened. And what I found, because the last chapter of The Gates of Europe, I was writing, it was very recent developments. Certain things I got wrong on the basis of the news reports that were there. If you write about the events of earlier this year, about the COVID, was it produced by the Chinese? Wasn't it produced by the Chinese? How many people died, and so on and so forth? And you have to take a guess and put it into the survey of 2,000-year history. So that is always difficult, and I thought whether I should do that. But then just by purely creating a chronology of those events, it turned out to be an eye-opener for myself. And it's still that chronology stands today with new sources available. So the time to write of history is any time, despite the fact that traditional definition is, of course, that history as a discipline deals with the processes that have been completed. And again, there I had a personal experience where I was writing the book on the fall of the Soviet Union, believing that it's a purely work of history, despite the fact of recent history. And once I finished it, I decided that actually the history of the fall of the Soviet Union is not over yet. So in a sense, that still was a book on the history in the making. In terms of references, again, there is a lot that appears in terms of the articles publication, first reactions, but I don't see one, or at least I don't know about one book, even brochure or short, something that you can go to and look at that. Again, what is very helpful, and I understand there will be a new edition of that book by Serhii Plokhii, and the title escapes me, but it's basically about Ukraine crisis or something like that, and it's almost like your catechesis in terms of questions and answers. And I know that the book will be updated, and they're republishing it in later in the fall this year. So it's also in the issues that are so contested. The big question is, whom can you trust, right? Unless you go there and check the sources and so on and so forth. And in that sense, of course, the track record of people who write about that is really a very important indicator of whether we can trust that or not. So again, it's not specifically on the Crimea, it's on crisis in general. It's history, it's politics, and it's very concise. But I would certainly start with Serhii Plokhii and the new edition that should appear in the fall.
Thank you. Eva, did you have a question? And then.
Okay, so.
Yeah, hello. My name is Eva, and I am a Polish art historian who's also I'm also participating in the course in Cambridge. But I was interested because I was trying to find your book in Polish. I read it in English, but I was interested whether it would be translated into Polish because I found this book, I mean, The Gates of Europe. I found it very interesting also from the Polish point of view. And I also feel that on the Polish market, we are really missing this kind of book that would give also some kind of understanding of the Polish-Ukrainian relations. So I wanted to ask if you think that the book will be translated or maybe already had offers of translation, because I am actually telling all my friends that they should really read it to understand a lot.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, the plans were, and the plans were even announced for the Polish translation of the book, and it was supposed to appear before any other Ukrainian, Chinese, or any other translation. Again, Znak was supposed to publish it. And then I was in Gdańsk, I believe, on the ceremony, accepting an award for the Last Empire book. And the publisher was there, and he told me, well, wouldn't you mind if you would first publish The Lost Kingdom, because we are publishing at the same time Anna Reid's history, this more journalistic account of the history of Ukraine. And I said, well, yes, of course. So the plans were buried, and the book is not out there till now, despite the fact that Znak continues to publish me. And my real concerns were about the publication of the translation in Russia, but it appeared. But it looks like that the book turned out to be less sensitive for whatever reason in Russia than it is in Poland. My suspicion is that it's not Anna Reid that I should blame for the book not appearing, but maybe the coverage of maybe Volhynia or maybe some other aspects. Again, I don't know, because the publisher never gave me a straight answer why the book that was already announced in print. It seems to me one of my books appeared already in Polish with actually some announcement there why it wasn't published. But that being said, again, I love my Polish publisher. I love my Polish readers. The books that I write are being translated almost right away, with one exception, The Gates of Europe.
I noticed that actually, because I was looking for that one, and in the meantime, I've seen every other book. So
Okay, so they bought the rights, they paid for the translation, and they're sitting on it. But I hope one day it will be out. My guess, maybe it is related to the political cycles in Poland.
I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I'm a first-year PhD student in early Soviet Ukrainian cinema, and I'm currently interested in the period around the Soviet annexation of Western Ukraine in 1939. So it seems to me that there's a paradox with Western Ukraine at that time, because on the one hand, it's very economically backwards, rural, undeveloped, But on the other hand, it also has a much more advanced sense of Ukrainian national identity than Central and Eastern Ukraine. So I was wondering, do you think that the Soviets in 1939 would have felt that Western Ukraine was in any way advanced or more superior to the rest of Soviet Ukraine, or would they have seen it only in economic and ideological terms? And also, do you think that the Soviet Union had an aim to annex those eastern provinces of Poland throughout the 1920s and 30s, or was it merely political opportunism in 1939?
Yes, thank you. And I guess you certainly are familiar with that basically propaganda film that was done by Alexander Dovzhenko, right?
Of course, yeah. Освобождение
you're familiar with the narrative that is there. Well, let me start answering with the question of whether it was a pure opportunism or not. And I looked at that specifically for a project that didn't materialize eventually, but there was one publication that came out of it, which is called "The Call of Blood: the Soviet Propaganda and the Start of the World War II," or something like that. It's an article published maybe 5-6 years ago. Well, I'm actually very proud, because I think I was able to find something there that others didn't see. And my impression overall is that there is a profound change in the way how the Soviets are looking at the eastern provinces of Poland between 1920s, 1930s, and then into 1939. And in the 1920s and 1930s, there is, of course, a competition which is summarized by Piemont principle, right?
Yeah.
And they got in trouble with that, because at the end, the Piemont principle is turned against them. So Skripnik and against Skripnik and others, you get the Shumsky and Shumskism, and the entire Communist Party of the Western Europe takes the side opposite to the position of Moscow and Kharkiv at that time. So there are mixed results out of the Piemont principle. And at the end, they changed their policy in the 1930s. If before that, they believed that they can use those national minorities to undermine the Polish state, in the 1930s, they're on the defensive. They're afraid that the Polish state can use the Ukrainians outside of Ukraine.
Okay.
Undermine. So the entire Holodomor story with the agents of Pilsudski and Petlura causing that is partially quintessentially what they think about. And so they're on the offensive in the 20s, they're on the defensive in the 1930s, and then suddenly 1939 comes. And that's when they turn on the offensive, but in a different way in terms of the occupation. And they are very, very careful or concerned. So there is a lot of debate and discussion about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Stalin and Hitler being equals. Well, Stalin was really very concerned about sending his troops across the border. And he didn't want to really burn bridges with the Western allies completely. He didn't want to risk the escalation in the Far East, so they sent the troops the morning. During the night, they signed agreement with the Japanese in the Far East. And they were pushed by Hitler, and Hitler said that, okay, you are supposed to move your troops are not there. So we have no other choice but create a bumper states in the territories that are supposed to be yours, which basically creating a Ukrainian state and either Belarusian or whatever it would be state. And after that, the troops are crossing the border, and they have to get Ribbentrop back in Moscow in September to redraw the map. Because what Stalin is concerned about after the partitioning of Czechoslovakia and after a short-lived Ukrainian state in Transcarpathia, he is concerned that Hitler now can use any small part of Ukrainian or Belarusian or other territory to make a claim for the rest under the banner of reunification, the banner that Hitler is using himself. So I don't want any Polish territory because the Polish card can be played the same way, but I want all the Ukrainian territory. So again, the overall vision is offensive in the 20s, defensive in the 30s, and then grabbing this opportunity by taking the territory by military force, but very much having the ethnicity map in mind, because Ribbentrop comes to Moscow in August of 1939 with the imperial map in mind. Okay, Warsaw was Russian back before 1917. We can go back Warsaw to you now and central Poland and so on and so forth. But Stalin thinks in national terms, partially because he has also to legitimize what he is doing to the world, to his own people, and to use nationality card to strengthen his own security. So that means no minorities left on either side of the border.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Again, oversimplification, but that's I would suggest as a general line to look at. And again, if you find something that doesn't really fit, again, you can revise the entire scheme and theory.
Of course, that's very interesting. Thank you. What about the idea of whether Western Ukraine was in any way more advanced than the rest of the USSR? Does that have any credence, or do you think they would have just regarded it as ideologically backward?
Well, I don't see that in their rhetoric, right? So they're bringing civilization with industrialization, with prosperity, with the collective farms, and so on and so forth. So yeah, they looked at it as a very dangerous place because of nationalism, but otherwise they look at it as a backward place and ripe for the socialist revolution as well. The interesting story is, of course, that the Western Ukraine is a creation of interwar period, and it consists of the former Austrian and Polish parts. And what is happening, Austrian and Russian parts. And what is Volhynia is Russian. Historically, when you look at the borders of the Russian Empire. And the most amazing story for me is not what is happening in the Polish part of Ukraine, where Hrushevs'kyi becomes a leader of Ukraine, right? He wasn't leader before, well, he was leader of the church, was not leader of the Ukrainian society as a whole. Before 1917, 1918, but then he becomes one. So there are interesting processes, but the most interesting process is Volhynia. How you turn the hotbed of the Союз Русского Народа, of the Union of the Russian people, into the hotbed of the Ukrainian nationalism. And again, it's not, a big part of that story is not interwar, but really the war. The war era per se, but again, that's just speaking about Western Ukraine. That it's an imagined community.
Of course, a composite in many ways. Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting.
Zach?
Thank you. I have two questions relating to your book, The Gates of Europe, if you don't mind.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Sorry, yes, my name is Zach. I'm studying the SL9 course, for whom the Gates of Europe is so important. My first question is about, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the role that Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars played in the awakening of Ukrainian national consciousness, because I remember you writing a little bit about how it kind of interacted with Polish national consciousness and their hopes that Napoleonic Wars would help them restore some form of Polish sovereignty. I think you wrote about how kind of, I think you pointed to the example of Hrushevs'kyi, who fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and how the Russians' kind of Ukrainian national consciousness was mobilized for the sake of defending against Napoleon's army. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Yes, sure. Well, with Napoleon, I don't remember whether I really put that way in the Gates of Europe or not, but for me, it's an interesting phenomenon that he brings this awakening of national identity or mobilization of it in different ways. It's a more or less well-known and clear case with Poland, right? He is there to restore the Polish, at least on a certain level, Poland on the map of Europe, and he is supported in that sense. And it's an early example of the using of nationality map in the global war, or global European war. That method is really used and perfected during World War I. So it's the Poland is there again. The Germans are thinking about it, how to play it. The Russians are thinking about it, how to play it. The mobilization of minorities inside of your enemy's territory becomes the key element of World War I, but Napoleon is there first, really, in 1806. So that case is more or less clear and well researched and documented. But for me, it was also interesting that what is happening on the Russian side of the border, and there is a rise of the early Russian nationalism in response to the foreign aggression. And it comes and it is formulated by the elites that are educated, whose first language is French, right? Pushkin's first language is not Russian, it's French. He had to, again, it's one of the languages that was there that then he uses. And as the Russians are trying to formulate their newly discovered, under the influence of Napoleonic wars, or create this new sense of identity, they look to the Polish model. Narodность, a key element of Uvarov's, and again, this is in the Gates of Europe, of Uvarov's, sorry, this is in the Lost Kingdom, of Uvarov's concept of this, the orthodoxy, the autocracy, and ethnicity or nationality or narodность. Narodность is basically it's a translation. It's a word stolen from Polish, so that's one thing. And with Ukraine, it's actually interesting. With Ukraine, the situation reminds me really the situation of World War II, where the Russian Empire, like Stalin during World War II, is allowing to mobilization other ethnic identities in support of this effort of struggling against fighting the outside enemy. And that's when you, for the first time, you see this poems, again, it is in the Gates of Europe, written about Napoleon and so on and so forth. So that situation of a threat, existential threat to the monarchy, existential threat to the empire, you go and you allow all forces that are out there to mobilize and to manifest themselves. And Ukraine, that is basically just in the process of the formation of this new new literature with Kotlarevsky and others is right there in 1806. Kotlarevsky is there leading the Cossack detachment in war against Napoleon. This is the creator of the modern Ukrainian literature. And again, that's really interesting, that whatever side you look at, but Napoleonic wars create this new national identity, and war does that relatively independently, autonomous from the ideas that French Revolution brings, and French Revolution contributes to that process. But again, that looks like almost two parallel processes. The war and the way how Napoleon uses nationality card in the war, and then the ideas of popular sovereignty that come not on the not with the French troops, but come separately through the books and newspapers and travel, extensive travel of the Russian imperial elites to Paris before all of that started.
Thank you very much. I actually have a second question, which I feel like will interest everyone who's doing SL9, because it's a lot more general. But there's a lot of, whenever people both in Ukraine and without are talking about Ukrainian national identity, a lot of attention is often drawn to the etymology of the word Ukraine, the name Ukraine. And historians write about this all the time, where the name came from and how it relates to the construction of Ukrainian national identity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the origin of the word Ukraine, where it came from and what it was applied to, because I've seen it used in reference to different sort of geopolitical formations like the Hetmanate or Sloboda Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, it seems to be quite a fuzzy area of history.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the cases where I had to be very, on the one hand, careful, on the other hand, very straightforward, because the issue of whether Ukraine means really the edge or in Russian Okrayina has became argument in this war and conflict. Okay, Ukraine is not a country, never was. It's just it's a territory at the end of something, which basically stresses periphery and not centrality, and the way to really denigrate and diminish a particular project or people or something like that. But the reality is that the term Ukraine is about the territory on the edge. We today, in the last maybe 20 years, with the explosion of the study of frontiers, suddenly started to appreciate the importance of frontiers per se, in terms of the places where the formation of the particular identities takes place, where the Moscow and Warsaw and Istanbul decide who they are in connection with each other, in the conflict with each other. And on the top of that, there is a particular homegrown identity and ethos and way of life emerges in the borderlands. So that was one way for me to basically deal with that controversy. In terms of someone tried something? No? Yeah, okay. But in terms of the what is the actual story, the Ukraine it seems to me it's 12th century the first time that it is mentioned in the chronicle. It's about the steppe borderlands of the Kievan Rus, from Pereyaslav all the way to the Podolia region. And this is really very important in the sense that that meaning continues and is there all the way into the 18th and even certainly into the 18th century. So it's not just any border. It's not the border between, I don't know, England and Wales or something like that, or between Germany and France. It's the border between the settled area and not settled area. In that particular context, it's the border between the settled areas and the steppe. And you look at the 16th, 17th century Ukrainian writings, translations of the Bible and religious texts, they write about the Palestinian Ukraine, which means the territory on the border with the desert. So it can be desert, it can be steppe, it can be prairies, it can be, but not settled areas or not permanently settled areas. And in the Russian usage, Ukraine means the same. When in the 17th century, the Russian voivodas, the local governments on the borderlands, write about their small fortresses, their forts. They separate between Lithuanian towns, which means basically on the border with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, today's Belarus. They talk about their Polish towns, which basically would be on the border with today's Ukraine, which was part of the Kingdom of Poland. And then they write about Ukrainne goroda, which are on the steppe borderland. And Ukraine eventually becomes a region in its own right with different definition of it in the 17th century with the rise of the Cossacks. And that became a second name for the entity that legally was known as the Zaporozhian host. So all the legal agreements, all the privileges, all the rights that were given to the Zaporozhian host. But they refer to themselves as Ukraine. On the other hand, the Russian Empire moves into what is today the Kharkiv region of Ukraine. And they have there this Sloboda settlements. So they called it Sloboda Ukraine. So the first time that the term Ukraine appears on the map, Russian imperial map, it is in relation to the Kharkiv region. So it is Ukraine from the Russian point of view. It's the former steppe borderland. The first journal that appears in Ukraine, it's Ukrainsky Vestnik, published in Kharkiv. And it's about the Vestnik of Ukrainskaya gubernia. It's about that Ukraine, but later it becomes a symbol. That's also the birthplace of the concept of modern Ukraine, which happened to be Slobodska Ukraine, right? So, and you have someone like Skovoroda, who writes an absurd thing from our point of view today, that he says that my mother is Little Russia, or my mother is Ukraine, but my aunt is Little Russia, or something like that. So what he means is that he was born in the Hetmanate, which now today's understanding is quintessential Ukraine because it's Cossack Ukraine. And went to Kharkiv, which is today for us is, okay, maybe Ukraine, maybe not a contested area. But he calls Kharkiv Ukraine and calls what we call today Ukraine Little Russia, right? And then, of course, 19th century, that's the period when you see the march of the term Ukraine westward. And Hrushevs'kyi calls his History of Ukraine Rus not only to unite different stages of the history of Ukraine, but also to unite two different names that the people in Galicia give to themselves. So to introduce to the traditional Rus name also name Ukraine. So again, it's what makes it interesting that it is in the flux. It is growing, it is developing, and the latest this expansion of the term Ukraine is the fact that I understand in today's Ukrainian passport you don't have actual ethnicity anymore, right? So it is, or again, if I don't have Ukrainian passport, so I can't check that. But in any terms, the term Ukrainian, Ukrainci today became kind of an umbrella term for the entire population of Ukraine, whether you're Jewish or whether you're Crimean Tatar, Russian or Ukrainian. So again, it is changing, and again, a big story will be to see what happens eventually. Not so much with the Crimea, but what happens with Eastern Ukraine, the separatist republics, or so-called republics, separatist fiefdoms, or whatever they are. Statelets is probably the good neutral term. So, because they announced just a publication of the 2000-year history of the Luhansk People's Republic, right? It will be interesting to see how they treat the issue of the Cossacks and Cossackdom and the term Ukraine. Another interesting example is what is happening in one of the regions of today's Russia, which is called Starodub, which historically was one of the key parts of the Hetmanate. Really a number of key figures in the Cossack history, including not Bezborodko, but a number of others, came from Starodub. But Starodub, ethnically, because of the settlement of the Old Believers, became predominantly Russian and became part of the Russian Federation. But it has this huge chunk of the Ukrainian history, which of course is not treated as Ukrainian history in the context of the Russian history, but as a history of Little Russia. So there is one part in the world, and this is Starodub, where the official history of the 16th, 17th, 18th century is a Little Russian history. So it is still there.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. Thank you.
Martha?
I really enjoyed reading your article in the Guardian where you kind of compared the current coronavirus crisis to Chernobyl. And I was kind of wondering, given that Chernobyl really kind of destabilized politics within the USSR and had such an immense impact, what do you think that the Chinese government have done that Gorbachev didn't in order to kind of maintain that stability and support for the government during the crisis? And kind of building on that, do you think that there will be any kind of big political fatalities as a result of this crisis?
Right. Well, I personally think that what she is doing and what Gorbachev was doing in terms of Chernobyl in the one case and coronavirus in another is actually is the same. There are two authoritarian regimes, and in '86 the Soviet Union was still very much authoritarian, which are they're not indifferent to the population that they're ruling of. They're not anymore Stalinist regime in the Soviet case, or it's not Maoist regime in the Chinese case. So they're not prepared to kill 4, 6, 50 million people to achieve their goals. They to a certain degree, they care about that population. They don't. Their goal is not to kill them or to expose specifically to any particular danger. But the authoritarian regimes, they have their own way of dealing with things. And foundation of why they're there, and their survival depends on the complete control over the information. And they apply that toolkit, what they have, or those principles, to dealing with whatever crisis they have. So they control the information, and they're concerned about panic and losing control over the population, the worst thing that could happen to the authoritarian regime. So they're trying to keep that under the wraps. On the other hand, they're very effective as authoritarian regimes and partially police regimes at mobilizing the resources. And again, so not to talk about those things at all, punish the people who talk about that. The KGB is going after the people who talk about Chernobyl. In China, they go after the doctor who first talks about that. And then in 2 weeks, the party policy changes, and now it's basically, now it's criminal not to take care of that, like in China. So again, I see a lot of parallels and more in common than differences. Whether the way how the Chinese government handled coronavirus will become another political Chernobyl, or the fallout political would be the same or not, it's too early to say, because nothing really happened in the Soviet Union for 2 years after Chernobyl. The government mobilized the resources, sent 600,000 people there. They got their dosage of irradiation. Others got theirs. They resettled part of the population. They didn't resettle other because they didn't have enough resources or enough information. And things continued moving in the same direction. So Chernobyl didn't explode politically until 2 or 3 years later. And for that to happen, you need a particular state of the authoritarian regime to be in. You need it to be in crisis. Economic, political, and otherwise, you need it to look for different sources of legitimacy. You need it to open, like it happened in the Soviet Union, the media to the expression of, again, in stages of different opinions. You have to not allow, but at least not to use the police against the mass gatherings. And that's what happened in the Soviet Union in 88, 89. So from the situation where there was a number of a small group of quote unquote dissidents who were concerned about that, who wanted to know truth about Chernobyl, to the mass mobilization, it didn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't happen if there would not be a crisis, economic, political, of the Soviet regime and attempts to reform it. If you look at the UN table of worst nuclear disasters, Chernobyl is at the top, then it is Fukushima. And what comes next is not 3 Mile Island, it's not wind-scale fire, but it is the accident in Kishtim, in Ural regions in Russia, that nobody knew anything about really. There were some rumors and until the Chernobyl mobilization took place, until 1990 and 91. So it's impossible for Chernobyl to be another Kishtim, because again, the information and radiation and information, of course, crossed the Iron Curtain. But it's quite possible that if the regime would be in a different stage of its development, Chernobyl would be not, it would be probably even more important in economic terms, in terms of the impact on the health and environment, but its political importance could be not next to zero, but close to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Serhii, I'm aware that it is an hour since you've been with us. Is it okay to ask another question?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, Alice Bennett, please.
Hi, I'm a student of both the SL9 and the SL12 course, and I really enjoyed both The Gates of Europe and The Last Empire. And I was just wondering, in your own words, what do you think is the main cause for the collapse of the USSR?
Oh my gosh. Well, there is a lot of those causes, right? And at the end, I would stick to my guns in the sense of the line that I take in The Last Empire, that it is about basically the dynamics of the 20th century, which is the century of the fall of the empires, which don't make sense anymore economically and politically. The Russians in the moment of crisis start count their money and decide that they're better off if they don't share the oil revenue with Central Asia. They're less sure about Ukraine. So, but they certainly are not there to keep Central Asia or Caucasus. Again, the Solzhenitsyn's idea of the big Russian nation is still there, so Ukraine and Belarus, and they're also economically potentially more developed than others, they should stay. This is Solzhenitsyn's idea, but other than that, the empire should go. Russians arrive to that conclusion in the middle of their crisis. And there is a conflict between they don't want the empire anymore, but they have, or at least part of them have, this pre-1917 idea of their Russian nationality that includes Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. But it's not imperial project anymore in its clear-cut case. Russian-Ukrainian relations today is not about empire. It's more about nation building. So the empire is just expired, and it expired everywhere. It expired in the Soviet Union as well, and it turned out to be the kind of relationship that didn't satisfy neither Britain nor India, neither Russia nor Ukraine. And it's about disinterest of the metropoly in continuing with the empire the way how it was, and it is about the mobilization of the national movements in the periphery. And Ukrainian case is the case of really cross-ethnic, cross-linguistic mobilization. So the independence of 1991 in Ukraine is a product of, it's paradoxical, a product of a political nation that is yet to be born. So it's manifests itself also in that independence. So that is the main reason, but there are many others, economic and others that bring that situation to the crisis that it was. But at the end of the day, when you look at the map of what used to be the Soviet Union, you can't explain it by economic alone or by the falling oil prices alone. Because if that would be about economics and oil prices, there would be no reason for St. Petersburg and Vladivostok to be in the same country. There would be a lot of reasons for St. Petersburg and Tallinn to be in the same country. Or the economic shock was more or less equal everywhere, and but some of the regions went independent, others did not. Why Chechnya is not formally at least independent? De facto it is, and Estonia is. So again, that's basically an attempt to argue that again economics are really very important, but it's also the other factors and political factors in particular, and the general trend away from the empire is all important, and it catches up. You look at that point at the end of the Cold War, not just with the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia falls apart, Yugoslavia falls apart. So it's the entire, this part of the formerly Ottoman and Russian Europe kind of catches up with the former Austrian Europe.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Are there any other questions? I would just like to ask the last question if possible. And I think I'm asking this question for a number of my students who are really interested in contemporary history and particularly in the figure of Zelensky. So since you are writing cultural history now, can you talk about how, well, first of all, have you watched his series, Sluha Narodu?
No, I can't bring myself to, no, I haven't. I have to.
Okay, so it was one of our primary sources, and I was wondering, so I was going to ask about what you thought of the way he uses the past or history to tell his story, but instead I'll ask, what do you think of the way this form of culture, popular culture, has impacted history, or how do you see the relationship between popular culture, or this form of popular culture, and historical developments of the last presidential election?
Oh, thank you. First of all, clearly I understand that I can't delay that anymore. I'm shamed in public for not watching Sluha Narodu, so I have to do that and continue my self-education. Well, in terms of the popular culture, I think it's, again, I don't have any particular insights, but it seems to me that this is the primary vehicle and through which society, especially contemporary society, acquires memory, right? Because most of our memory is not ours memory, right? It's been formed, prepackaged, and fed to us in different ways. And anything that comes from literature, from film, from performance, and things like that, it has this additional ability to penetrate you, in a sense, to stay with you, to stuck to your mind, and not just in terms of the rational information, but in terms of images, which are sometimes are much more powerful. So I think it's a very important medium of communication, and whoever masters it really masters the world.
So do you think the sitcom basically made the current president of Ukraine? Did he win because of the sitcom? Was that his campaign?
Well, it certainly was one of the main reasons how he became widely popular. Because again, he was picked up. There was a cast of people. They were looking for fresh faces, that oligarchic and other groups. And one of the prerequisites was that you are supposed to be known by the public. So in Ukraine, you have a mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, who is there because he was known to the public. There was, it looks like now, half-failed attempt of Sviatoslav Vakarchuk to go into really big politics. And Zelensky was there not so much because of his concerts, because they're quite expensive in terms of the tickets and who could get there, but because of the free TV time that was given to him by Kolomoisky, one of the oligarchs. So again, it's like with the fall of the Soviet Union. It's probably all impossible to put the question, okay, this is the reason, but this is one of the reasons why he is there. Yes.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to thank on behalf of all of us here for just making the time to speak to us. And I certainly do hope that we will have the chance to bring you to Cambridge in person next year. So thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Again, thanks for this opportunity, and thank you very much for your questions. And keep studying, keep reading.
Thank you. Keep writing.
All the best, and have a good and safe summer.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.